Staff enters through the service door, the man said, stepping in front of her like she was lost. Oh, how quaint, a woman behind him chimed in, voice thick with champagne and condescension. Did someone let the cleaning crew onto the guest list? Lena Temple froze. Just 3 steps from the door, and already she didn't belong. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the slate roof of the Cambridge Fellows Society, casting long shadows across the stone courtyard. Soft music floated from the string quartet, perfectly timed with the arrival of champagne. Everything about this event screamed legacy and exclusivity, from the engraved name cards to the monogrammed napkins. And Lena Temple? She had RSVP'd weeks ago. She wore her Sunday best, and she had raised the man they were about to toast as a visionary of modern education. But still, 3 steps from the door, and someone decided she wasn't supposed to be here. The man in the navy blazer didn't even look her in the eyes as he repeated, "Ma'am, deliveries and staff enter through the east wing. This entrance is for donors and guests only." "I'm here with my son," Lena said calmly, holding up the invitation. "Dr. Xavier Temple." The name did something. A blink, a stutter, but not enough to move his feet. And before he could respond, the woman behind him laughed again. "You must be mistaken. Dr. Temple is the keynote tonight," she said with a smirk. "Unless he brought his maid?" Lena didn't flinch, but she felt it. Deep. Across the patio, Xavier Temple stood mid-sentence on stage, raising a crystal flute for the opening toast. His smile faltered. He had scanned the crowd, instinctively looking for his mother. She always slipped in quietly, never liked the spotlight. But she wasn't seated. Then he spotted her, near the door, blocked, staring ahead, motionless. A man in uniform, a woman in pearls, her hand clutching her purse. Shoulders straight, chin high. But he knew that look. He had seen it before, when the bank manager spoke down to her, when the real estate agent smiled too tightly. The words on his cue card vanished. The applause around him dimmed. And for the first time in a decade of public speaking, Xavier Temple said nothing. He set down the champagne glass and stepped off the stage. Lena eventually walked in. They let her pass, of course, after a few awkward blinks and a half-mumbled apology. But by then, the damage was done. She didn't make a scene. She never did. She found her seat near the back, not the reserved one Xavier had arranged near the trustees. That would have drawn too much attention. She adjusted her shawl, smoothed her skirt, and smiled politely when the server offered sparkling water. Xavier found her 10 minutes later, just outside the banquet hall. "Ma," he said gently. "You didn't have to come find me," she replied, eyes still soft but tired. "You okay?" "I've been through worse," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I know." She placed her hand on his wrist. "Don't ruin your night over this. These things, they pass." He didn't answer, just stood there, jaw tight. Lena lowered her voice. "I know you want to fix it, but not everything needs a response." "This does," Xavier said quietly, and she heard it, that tone beneath the calm. The one that came out when he was 15 and a teacher accused him of cheating because his test score was too perfect. The tone she heard when the hospital asked if she could afford the surgery up front before they'd even read her chart. He wasn't angry. He was resolved. Later that night, as the gala dragged on without him, Xavier sat alone in his apartment in Jersey City, tie loosened, eyes on the skyline. He didn't drink often, but tonight he poured a small glass of something sharp, let it sit on the table. He opened his laptop, logged into the Eduverse ethics console, a screen few had access to. One blinking option glowed in red. Trigger ethics override. Funding compliance review. He didn't click it. Not yet. Instead, he opened a private server log, something his team barely touched anymore. He typed, "Begin internal audit on Whitford Foundation. Historical scholarships, applicant data, rejection patterns. Focus. Ivy League relationships, 1980 present. He hit enter and sat back. In another tab, he opened the raw access log from earlier that evening, the audio transcript of the front door security feed. His mother's voice came through, calm, dignified, followed by the voice of the woman in pearls. "Did someone let the cleaning crew onto the guest list?" The moment landed harder on tape than it did in person. His mother hadn't responded, but Xavier heard the breath she took right after. The pause, the silence. And in that silence, he made his decision. The next morning, Julian, his COO, called early. "Board wants a pre-brief on the Whitford partnership. You good for 2 p.m.? Xavier didn't respond right away. Then, "Cancel it." Julian blinked. "Cancel what?" "The meeting, the deal, all of it." Silence. "You serious?" "Dead serious." Julian exhaled slowly. "They're expecting a signature today. You know what this means, right?" "I do." "And you're doing this because my mother walked into a room and someone thought she was the help." Julian didn't argue. He knew better. That night, news hadn't broken yet. But Xavier knew it would. Not because he'd speak, but because systems speak when you hit the right button. He hadn't clicked override yet, but the cursor was hovering. And this time, it wasn't just about a contract. It was about a line, and who still gets told to stand behind it. Lena Temple never liked early mornings, but she still rose before sunrise. Even after retirement, after the library doors had long stopped needing her keys, she kept the same rhythm: quiet wake-ups, slow coffee, and a radio that only played jazz before 7 a.m. That morning, her coffee went cold, because her mind was somewhere else, on marble floors, the crisp voice of a woman in pearls, and the way her son had looked at her. Not angry, not embarrassed, just quiet. And that silence said more than anything. Her phone buzzed around 8:15. "Good morning, Ma." Xavier's voice was soft on speaker. "Didn't think I'd hear from you this early," Lena said, trying to sound normal. "I just wanted to check in." "I told you I was fine." "I know." He paused. "Did you eat?" "That's not checking in, that's mothering me back," she teased. Xavier smiled faintly on the other end, though she couldn't see it. Then came the silence. Not uncomfortable, but weighty. "You canceled the deal," Lena said, her tone quiet, matter-of-fact. "I didn't sign it," he replied. "Yet. But you're going to." It wasn't a question. He didn't answer. "I thought so," she said softly, folding her arms. "I could have handled it, you know." "I know. And you don't owe me a war just because someone couldn't recognize dignity in a dark-skinned woman in flats." Xavier let out a quiet breath. It wasn't about recognition. It was about permission. They didn't just dismiss you, they assumed you didn't belong. "That's not new," she said simply. "It should be." That landed harder than either expected. Lena reached for her lukewarm coffee. "You built a company, Xavier, with real value, with power. You don't need to prove anything." "I'm not trying to prove anything." He looked out the window of his apartment at the city, still foggy from the night before. "I'm trying to protect something." By noon, the news hadn't hit yet. Only a few people in Helix EdTech's leadership team knew Xavier had pulled out of the deal. The PR firm was still finalizing the planned joint statement between Helix and Whitford Foundation. Only now there wouldn't be one. In the office, the mood was tense. Julian, the COO, paced outside Xavier's glass-walled corner office. Naya, head of marketing, leaned against the far wall, arms folded. "You know the investors will lose it, right?" Julian said finally. "I'd rather they lose money than we lose our integrity," Xavier replied flatly. "Those aren't mutually exclusive, you know," Julian snapped back. Nia cut in. "Hold on. Before we panic, we need to talk about what this does to the brand. And I don't mean image, I mean identity." Julian shot her a look. "Now's not the time for a TED Talk on ethics." "It's exactly the time," Naya said. You think pulling out of a $780 million deal isn't going to get noticed? This isn't just business. This is cultural now. Viral territory. We're not trying to go viral, Xavier said. Naya looked him dead in the eye. You might not be trying, but you already did. By the time Xavier got back to his apartment that evening, the private servers he'd launched the night before had finished running. The data was damning. Scholarship rejections, unbalanced demographic ratios, emails that hinted, sometimes explicitly, at what Lena had faced years ago. One folder in particular caught his eye. 1981, Fellowship Finalist Notes, L. Temple. He opened it. There it was. His mother's name, typed clean in the header. Scanned feedback. Overqualified. Doesn't present Ivy-facing image. Another line. Concerned about cultural fit. External pressures possible. Xavier stared at it. Not for the first time, but maybe for the last time with restraint. He picked up the photo on his desk. His mother at 28, standing outside a small school library in Newark, holding a clipboard and smiling. She didn't get that fellowship, but she showed up to work every day anyway. That night, he called Lena again. "Ma," he said, voice lower this time. "I found the file." She didn't say anything. It was them. I know. I wanted to believe. Maybe it was just the times. Or a mistake. Something impersonal. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then, "Baby, systems aren't personal. That's what makes them dangerous." He sat with that. "It was never about you," she said gently. "It was always about protecting the space around them." Xavier leaned back in his chair. "I think I'm done protecting them." Later that night, Julian sent one last message. "Board needs confirmation by tomorrow 9 a.m. Final signatures. They won't wait." Xavier didn't answer. Instead, he reopened the Eduverse Ethics Protocol dashboard. This time, he clicked. Initiate Ethics Override, Whitford Foundation. A pop-up appeared. This action will suspend funding compliance status for all academic institutions affiliated with the selected partner. Proceed? He hovered, then tapped yes. At 6:12 a.m. the next morning, the system flagged 4 Ivy League institutions. Non-compliant partner flagged. Whitford Foundation. Automatic review triggered. Scholarship audit pending. The cascade had begun. And Xavier hadn't said a word publicly. Yet. The ballroom was packed with power. White linen. Gold-rimmed flutes. The soft buzz of legacy names murmuring over shellfish towers and dry Chardonnay. And at the front, a long table draped in royal blue. 2 thick folders with brass clasps. 1 empty chair. They were waiting on Dr. Xavier Temple. The signing ceremony for the Whitford Helix EdTech partnership was meant to be a moment, a milestone, a merging of old money and new innovation. It had taken 14 months, 3 cities, and no less than 30 attorneys to finalize the contract. The press was outside. The champagne was chilling, but the chair remained empty. "Is he running late?" someone whispered. "He's probably prepping for the camera op," another shrugged. But Julian Ricks, Helix's COO, knew better. He sat stiffly, tugging at his cuffs, phone screen face down. Nia stood nearby, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Neither of them had spoken in 10 minutes. Then Preston Whitford stepped to the mic. Sleek, polished, 5th-generation executive from the Whitford dynasty. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're honored to be here today to celebrate a shared vision for educational equity, access, and advancement," he began. The kind of sentence rich people say right before they erase you with a smile. He motioned to the chair. "And we are grateful to partner with Helix EdTech's visionary leadership." The crowd applauded. Cameras clicked. But still, no Xavier. Back in Midtown, inside his office overlooking Market Street, Xavier stood at the tall window with his hands in his pockets. He was dressed for the occasion. Dark suit, no tie. Crisp, but quiet. He hadn't moved for several minutes. The screen behind him glowed faintly. Eduverse notifications blinked in sequence. Ethics override. Complete. 4 partner universities under review. Whitford compliance. Flagged. Public notice in 6 hours. Julian's call came in for the 4th time. Xavier didn't pick up. Instead, he grabbed the folder on his desk, the contract, and tossed it gently into the recycling bin. Then he reached for his keys. At the ballroom, someone from Whitford's legal team whispered, "We need to delay. Just 30 minutes." Preston clenched his jaw. He's making a statement. That's what this is. What kind of statement? But Preston already knew. He turned just as the double doors opened. And there he was, Xavier Temple, calm, controlled, alone. He walked across the room like he owned nothing, but owed no one. The crowd shifted, half seated straighter. The other half instinctively checked their phones. Xavier walked straight to the table, placed his hands on the back of the empty chair. Didn't sit. Instead, he looked out at the faces staring back. Some curious, some annoyed, a few nervous. And then he said, clear and steady, "I want to say something before anyone signs anything." The room froze. Even the glasses stopped clinking. "You all know how long this deal has taken. You know the promises we've made to each other and the vision we told ourselves we were serving." He glanced briefly at Preston, then back at the crowd. "But I'm not signing." 2 seconds passed. Someone coughed. Another said, "Wait, what?" Preston stepped forward, stiff smile still hanging on. "If there's an issue, I'm sure we can go back to the table." "There is no more table," Xavier cut in. Now every phone was out. People started recording. Preston's smile broke. "Xavier, let's not make this bigger than it is." "It already is," Xavier said. "You see, I watched my mother walk into this building last week and get treated like background noise." Murmurs rippled. She was mistaken for a server, dismissed, mocked, and when she gave her name, someone still assumed she didn't belong. Preston's face darkened. "You're letting a misunderstanding derail a national partnership?" "No," Xavier said. "I'm letting disrespect disqualify it." Victoria Whitford, matriarch of the family, was seated at the front table, pearls firm against her collarbone. She looked unimpressed. "She's not relevant to this agreement," she said flatly. Xavier turned toward her. "She's my mother." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't change what she looks like to other people." A gasp went up. Phones captured every second. Xavier stepped forward, voice low but clear. "I built this company from scratch, with people who believed in a world where access meant more than appearances. I didn't take money from people who'd never been denied anything in their lives just to let them decide who deserves to belong." "You're throwing away $780 million, Preston hissed. Xavier didn't blink. "There are deals you lose sleep over not signing. This isn't one of them." He nodded once to Naya, who'd quietly entered the room. She handed him a folder. Xavier opened it, pulled out one sheet, and placed it on the table, then turned back to the crowd. "As of this morning, Whitford Foundation has been flagged by the Eduverse ethics system for failure to meet inclusion and historical equity standards." Victoria scoffed. "You made that system." "Exactly," he said. "Which is why I trust it." The room descended into chaos. Preston turned red. "You're bluffing. You don't have the authority." "Check your email," Naya said calmly, stepping forward. At that moment, several phones pinged across the room. Subject line, "Urgent. Ethics alert. Whitford Foundation. Status, non-compliant." Screens lit up. Victoria's hand tightened on her clutch. Preston looked like he'd swallowed his own ambition. Xavier took one last look at the table, then walked away. No papers, no signature, no handshake. Just a clean exit. And a very loud silence. 3 blocks away, outside Helix HQ, the first journalist caught the story. "Dr. Temple, is it true you canceled the deal because of a racial slur?" Xavier didn't stop walking. "Are you walking away from nearly $1 billion over a comment?" Still no response. Inside the building, his staff was already bracing for fallout. But the first message in their inbox wasn't anger. It was gratitude. From teachers, grad students, custodians, parents, even CEOs. All saying the same thing. "Thank you for not letting it slide." The first post dropped at 9:42 a.m. Just a blurry clip from the gala ballroom, posted by a junior analyst who probably wasn't supposed to be filming. The angle was shaky, the audio cut in and out. But one line was clear as day. "You're throwing away $780 million. There are deals you lose sleep over not signing. This isn't one of them." Boom. By 10:10, the video hit 40,000 views. By noon, it was everywhere. CNN breaking news banner. CEO walks away from $780 million deal over alleged racial disrespect toward mother. Forbes push alert. Temple versus Whitford. When ethics overrule equity. Black Twitter. Already 5 trending hashtags. Hashtag Temple did that. Legacy means nothing / protect black mothers / walked out right. This is the line inside Helix HQ. The air felt electric. Some called it chaos. Others called it history. In the 18th floor boardroom, every screen was lit. Zoom squares filled with investors, advisors, legal, press liaisons. Nia Whitlow, head of marketing, stood at the front, phone in one hand, notes in the other. "Look, we didn't plan this storm, but we sure as hell better know how to sail it." Julian leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Investor calls are split. Half want blood, half want branding strategy. Both want reassurance," Nia said. "And we're not giving them that if we look scared." Xavier stood quietly near the window. He hadn't said much since the walkout. But now, finally, he turned. "Let them talk." The room stilled. "Let them debate. Let them wonder. Let them ask why we walked away." Julian raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Xavier nodded. "Because in that silence, we're going to say something louder." And outside? The silence didn't last long. By 3:00 p.m., a former fellowship recipient from Dartmouth posted a TikTok. "I was one of the few black students to receive the Whitford Legacy Grant. You know what they told me? That I spoke surprisingly well." Hundreds of comments. Dozens more duets. Then came a video from a Latinx caterer. "They made us enter through the back. Wouldn't let us use the lobby. Told us it was optics. That was 3 months ago. Same family, same foundation." And just like that, the curtain ripped. At 5:15 p.m., Ediverse released an official compliance bulletin. Whitford Foundation, status, non-compliant. 4. Ivy League partner schools flagged 3 additional institutions pending funding transparency reviews. Initiated. The bulletin didn't say what happened, but it said enough. And for people who'd spent decades watching injustices brushed off as unfortunate misunderstandings, this wasn't just news. It was a shift in gravity. By dinner, cable news anchors were already debating it live. Host: "This could disrupt billions in academic funding. Is Dr. Temple a hero or reckless?" Panelist: "He's a black son protecting his mother. That shouldn't be controversial." Other guest: "But what precedent does this set? Personal offense, canceling public infrastructure." Panelist 2: "This wasn't personal offense. This was a system being exposed. The man just refused to stay quiet." Meanwhile, back in Newark, Lena Temple turned off the television. She sat on her front porch, hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Neighbors had stopped by earlier, Ms. Deidre from church, Malik from down the block, dropping off food she didn't ask for and pride she didn't quite know how to carry. She hadn't wanted this attention, never did. But now, her face was being shared in videos, in montages, next to phrases like dignity and the mother behind the moment. A lot of people were speaking her name. Still, all she wanted was a little quiet. Xavier called that night. "Ma, I've seen it," she said before he could finish. "I didn't do it for the attention." "I know," she said, "but you've got it now." He let out a small laugh. "Yeah, it's a bit loud." She paused. "You okay with that?" He looked out the window, city lights blinking like questions. "I don't know. Feels like I opened a door I didn't mean to." "You didn't open it," Lena said softly. "You knocked it off its hinges." He went quiet. Then, "You mad?" "No," she said. "Just protective. People lift you up fast when they think you're brave, but they drop you just as fast when you make them uncomfortable." "I'm used to that." "I know, but I'm your mother. I still worry." Xavier smiled. "You taught me to stand for something." Lena sipped her tea. "I also taught you to sit when you're tired. Don't forget that." The next morning, Xavier entered Helix to find a note taped to his office door. Just 4 words. "You were right. N." He smiled faintly. Inside, Julian was already waiting. "Okay," Julian said, setting down a thick packet. "PR wants a statement. Legal wants a firewall, and 3 universities want clarification on whether they're about to lose their ethics badge. What's the fallback?" "There is none," Julian said. "You made the move. This is the new normal." Xavier nodded, then said, "Good." He turned to the whiteboard and wrote 4 words at the top. "What does respect cost?" And under it, "What if we stopped paying with silence?" That same hour, a quiet war broke out inside Ivy League boardrooms. Harvard issued a soft press release. "We are committed to exploring questions of legacy, access, and inclusive values." Columbia followed. "We are reviewing our funding partnerships in light of recent ethical standards." Brown? They said nothing, but quietly, they called Helix's New York office. And behind closed doors, at Whitford headquarters in Connecticut, chaos reigned. Victoria Whitford slammed her hand on the table. "You let him walk," she snapped at Preston. "We didn't let him. He chose to. And now the media has decided he's Malcolm X in a suit." "You realize how dangerous that is, don't you?" Victoria hissed. "He made us look irrelevant. Weak. Like we're the problem." "Maybe," Preston muttered. "Because maybe we are." She turned sharply. "Excuse me? Maybe it's not just him. Maybe it's the system. Ours. The one we built to feel safe." She stared at him. "You sound just like them." Preston didn't flinch. "I think I'd rather that than sound like you." At precisely 8:02 a.m., the first domino fell. Harvard's Office of Institutional Partnerships sent an internal memo to over 500 staff. Effective immediately, all future financial disbursements from the Whitford Foundation are paused pending compliance reassessment with the Helix ethics standards. It wasn't loud, it wasn't public, but it was seismic. By 8:45, Princeton followed with a quiet directive. Suspend all joint initiatives involving Whitford grants until clarity is reached. Columbia called it procedural review. Yale called it ethical diligence. But no one called it what it was. Fear. They had all seen the compliance flag. They all knew what it meant. If you ignored it, you risked losing Helix access. And losing Helix access meant losing your rankings, your donors, your credibility. In his Manhattan office, Xavier sat with Naya and Julian, watching the university dashboards flicker with updates. 4 more compliance pause notices, 7 pending reviews, 3 institutional requests for private consultations. Helix's ethics protocol was no longer just a tech infrastructure. It had become a currency. "Legacy is crumbling in real time," Naya whispered, scanning the list. "It's not crumbling," Xavier said. "It's correcting." At the Whitford estate in Greenwich, Victoria was pacing like a trapped animal. Her assistant held out her phone. "You need to read this." "I don't need Twitter updates." "It's not Twitter. It's the Chronicle of Higher Education." Victoria grabbed the phone, eyes scanning the headline. End of an era? How Xavier Temple's walkout rewired Ivy League compliance. She read in silence, then tossed the phone onto the marble floor. This boy just pulled the thread on everything we built. Preston sat calmly on the edge of the couch, hands clasped. Then maybe it wasn't built right. She spun toward him. This is your fault too. Preston didn't blink. I think it's the first time we're being held accountable. That doesn't make it my fault. Meanwhile, across the country, a small liberal arts college in North Carolina made headlines. Their statement was bold. We stand with Helix. Any foundation or fund that fails to meet ethical standards, regardless of size or history, will be removed from our partnerships effective immediately. It was the first public declaration, not hidden in memos, not softened by PR, just a clear line in the sand. And that line started spreading like wildfire. By noon, national media had pivoted from, was Xavier right, to, what does this mean for legacy donors everywhere? Panelists debated ethics versus endowments. Talk show hosts quoted Xavier's line. Young students posted TikToks explaining how the Temple protocol just flipped the power dynamic of campus funding. And at the center of it all, a single man who wasn't even speaking anymore. Xavier had gone quiet, on purpose. He didn't need to chase the narrative. He was the narrative. That night, Julian found him sitting on the rooftop balcony of Helix HQ. Wind tugged gently at Xavier's shirt as he looked out at the glowing skyline. Julian handed him a folder. Stanford wants a full Helix audit to replace their internal compliance system. Xavier raised a brow. Seriously? They want to go all in, publicly. He whistled softly. That's bold. Julian nodded. And risky. Xavier looked up. You worried? Julian hesitated. I'm not worried you're wrong. I'm worried about what they'll do when they realize you're not backing down. They'll adjust, Xavier said simply. And if they don't? Xavier turned toward him, eyes steady. Then they don't belong in the future we're building. The next morning, Lena Temple was standing in her small community church when her pastor paused mid-sermon. He held up his phone. I don't usually do this, he said, smiling sheepishly. But I think it's worth interrupting the sermon for. He turned to the crowd. Today, the National Education Ethics Council just confirmed that they're formally integrating Helix's standards into their evaluation framework. The congregation gasped. Ms. Deidre clapped. Malik shouted, "Yes, God," from the third row. And Lena, she just bowed her head, silently, proudly. Meanwhile, inside the Whitford Foundation's legal wing, tension reached its boiling point. Half the board wanted to settle, apologize, re-enter negotiations with Helix. The other half wanted to fight, issue a counter-narrative, allege bias, file injunctions. Victoria slammed her hand on the table. If we let this go unchecked, we are done. We are no longer the gatekeepers. One advisor cleared his throat. Ma'am, that may already be true. She stared him down. Then we remind them who built the gate. But deep inside, even she could feel it. The gate was gone. And Xavier Temple didn't ask for a key. He built a new road. At 6:24 p.m., Xavier released a single post. Just a black square with white text. Respect is not negotiable. Access is not unconditional. XT. No hashtags. No logo, no video, just conviction. And that night, thousands shared the image. Students printed it on signs. Professors used it in lectures. News anchors quoted it like scripture. By the end of the week, 4 major Ivy League schools had paused over $240 million in pending donor agreements. Helix announced a new initiative, the Access Standard Pledge, a public database of verified compliant funders. For the first time, donors had to qualify for influence. And legacy didn't count as credentials. And the Whitfords? They watched as their empire was not destroyed, but simply outgrown by a world that had decided, enough silent mothers, enough closed doors, enough unchecked power. And through it all, Xavier said only one thing to the press. My mother was humiliated. My name just happened to be on the paperwork that fixed it. The first hit came at 2:07 a.m. A Twitter account with 15 followers posted a blurry photo of Xavier from 6 years ago, exiting a bar, eyes tired, shirt untucked. Funny how the ethics guy forgot his own standards. #Helix hypocrite. It didn't trend, but someone wanted it to. By 6:43 a.m., a thread began circulating on Reddit. Unpopular opinion: Helix's founder isn't some ethical hero, just another rich kid with a savior complex. It was posted by a newly made account. Username @ethicaldoubt2025. Activity 0 before today. Upvotes suspiciously fast. By noon, 3 think pieces appeared on sketchy blogs. The truth about Helix's compliance loopholes. Is Helix ethics just a power grab in disguise? Xavier Temple's dangerous monopoly on morality. And then came the bots. Thousands of comments, recycled phrases, doubts disguised as dialogue. Something was moving, and it was coordinated. Inside Helix HQ, the mood was tense. Julian walked into the war room. Yes, they called it that now, with a tablet full of flagged content. We're getting hit from 5 directions at once. Twitter, Reddit, LinkedIn, YouTube, even Quora. Naya didn't look up. Quora? Julian shrugged. Apparently people still use it. Xavier stood silently in the corner, arms folded, eyes scanning the timeline they'd sketched across the whiteboard. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, strategic, funded. Naya looked at him. You thinking what I'm thinking? He nodded. Whitford's finally playing offense. Meanwhile, at the Whitford estate, Victoria sat at the head of the long oak conference table, surrounded by her inner circle. She didn't look like a woman on the ropes. She looked like a woman who had bled too much to lose politely. We let them control the story for 2 weeks, she said calmly. That was our mistake. Not anymore. Her strategist, Lawson Kent, tapped the screen behind her. A slide flickered to life. Counter-narrative strategy, Phase 1. We have bots seeding doubt, he explained. Next, we leak internal memos from their early ethics drafts. Make it look like they exploited bias data. Victoria nodded slowly. And Temple? Lawson smiled. We're soft-targeting his past. Fraternity records, financial backers, anything that muddies his clean brand. Another advisor leaned in. But if we go too hard, it might backfire. He's still respected. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Then we make the respect look naive. That night, Xavier's inbox filled with polite requests for comment on recent allegations. A few claimed Helix had unfairly penalized small institutions. Others implied the ethics ratings were culturally biased. One asked, point blank, if Helix had a diversity problem of its own. It was smoke. All smoke. But it burned. In Newark, Lena Temple noticed the shift too. Her neighbor, Mrs. Ellison, paused mid-conversation at the grocery store. You sure your son's okay? They're saying all kinds of things now. Lena smiled gently. They always do when someone stops asking for permission. But later that night, as she sat with her tea, Lena opened her laptop and typed Xavier Temple into Google. The search results had changed. There was still praise, but now it was layered with whispers. And she knew what whispers could do, especially to a black man who refused to bend. Back at Helix, Xavier held an emergency all-hands meeting. The core team gathered around the long glass table, some anxious, some angry, all focused. We're not defending rumors, Xavier began. But we're not staying silent either. Julian raised an eyebrow. So, what's the plan? We fight, by proving our systems are better than their noise. He walked over to the board and wrote 2 words. Ethical access. The industry still operates like a locked garden. Legacy controls the gate. We're going to build an open, public-facing gate instead, based purely on values." Naya leaned in. "You mean like an actual platform?" "A live compliance interface," Xavier nodded, "where anyone, any student, donor, admin, can check where a funder stands." "Real-time transparency," Julian murmured. "No more shadows. No more backroom legacy," Xavier added. "If you want influence, you need to pass the light test." The next 48 hours were war. As the bot attacks escalated, Helix launched ethicalaccess.org, a clean, searchable, live dashboard that listed every partner funder, their rating, their last audit date, and their compliance history. It was brutal. Brutal because it was honest. 2 top foundations lost their top-tier status within hours. 3 schools suspended incoming donations. And best of all, the public could see everything. The smoke had nowhere to hide. Meanwhile, back at the Whitford PR office, panic began to ripple. "Sir, 5 of our donors just called, asking if they were on the compliance list. They're scared." "Good," Victoria snapped. "Fear is leverage." But Lawson shook his head. "No, it's different now. Before we owned the shadows. Now he's turned on the floodlights." Victoria stood quietly, jaw clenched. "How much exposure do we have?" He swallowed. "Too much." 3 days later, an investigative piece dropped from The Atlantic. How Helix's new ethics portal quietly reshaped $3.1 billion in donor pathways. It didn't even mention Xavier's name until paragraph 6. Because by now, this wasn't just his story. It was a system-level shift. And the people who had built empires on silence, they weren't just being challenged, they were being measured. Back at Helix, Naya brought in cupcakes. Small celebration. "Access dashboard hit 1.4 million views in 24 hours, she said with a grin. "Even TikTok's on it now." Julian raised his bottle of sparkling water. "To transparency." Xavier lifted his. "To mothers." They tapped bottles. Then Xavier stepped aside, checking his phone. One message from Lena. "They're trying to make noise, but you didn't raise your voice. You raised the standard. I see you, baby." Xavier smiled. And for the first time in a week, he exhaled. 3 weeks after the incident at the country club, the war had moved to unfamiliar terrain. Public opinion. And Victoria Whitford was no fool. She knew better than to keep playing from the shadows, so she brought in a face. His name was Thomas Albright, former university president, decorated philanthropist, white-haired, soft-spoken, always in a navy blazer, beloved by faculty, quoted in commencement speeches. To most people, he was the embodiment of legacy, but to Victoria, he was a perfect shield. On Tuesday morning, Thomas sat in a pre-recorded interview with a primetime anchor. "While I admire Mr. Temple's passion, we must be cautious," he said smoothly. "This rush toward public audits and online dashboards may erode the discretion vital to long-standing academic relationships." He folded his hand. "Ethics matter, but so does context." The comment was calm, respectable, and it sparked a storm. By that afternoon, the hashtag #ContextMatters was trending. Some used it to defend Xavier's model. Others used it to undermine it. YouTubers made videos. Think tanks published essays. Podcasts titled episodes "Transparency versus Tradition: Who Really Wins?" Inside Helix HQ, Nia was fuming. She slammed her laptop shut. "Context? Really? They're making it sound like Xavier just started burning down libraries." Julian paced behind her, scanning the latest media poll. "They're not trying to win the argument," he muttered. "They're trying to dilute the clarity." Xavier walked in, holding a coffee he hadn't touched. He didn't look mad. He looked calculated. "They brought out the institutional mascot," he said dryly. "I must have rattled them more than I thought." Nia shook her head. "Albright's not just a face, Xavier. He's respected. People who would never defend the Whitfords are nodding along with him," Julian added. "And he's saying things that sound reasonable, until you realize they keep the same old doors locked." That night, Xavier released a short video. Just him, in a dark hoodie, sitting in a corner of his office. No lights. Only his laptop glow lighting his face. I respect experience, but let's not confuse comfort with credibility. If your legacy only survives in silence, then it was never strong to begin with. He didn't say Albright's name. He didn't need to, and the video hit 4.3 million views overnight. The next morning, a clip resurfaced from 6 years ago. A student-led panel where Thomas Albright had made an offhand comment. "We have to be careful about over-prioritizing inclusion. It risks diluting standards." The quote went viral. People were outraged. Suddenly, Hatchet Context Matters had a second meaning, one that didn't favor Thomas. But Xavier didn't cheer, didn't repost, didn't weaponize it. Instead, he posted a message. "This isn't personal, it's structural. Keep your eyes on the system." That restraint made the public trust him even more. Meanwhile, Victoria was furious. "We gave them a face, a name they could respect. And what did he do? He walked around it like it didn't matter." Lawson, her strategist, adjusted his tie. "We underestimated how allergic people are to anything that smells like legacy defense." "Then flip it," she barked. "Find someone younger, brown skin, with a degree. Let them challenge him." Lawson paused. "That's dangerous." "Exactly, but we're out of clean options." A few days later, a rising scholar named Jared Thomas published a blog on Medium, "Why I Respect Xavier Temple and Why He's Still Wrong." He was black, 32, Harvard and Oxford educated, a darling of liberal foundations, and his post wasn't aggressive. It was measured. "We need reform." Absolutely. But Helix's centralized model risks creating a new kind of gatekeeping, this time digital and data-driven. What happens when algorithms define virtue? It spread fast. CNN hosted Jared. MSNBC hosted Xavier. Clips of their interviews were edited side by side, and for the first time, audiences felt torn. In Newark, Lena Temple was watching both interviews at once. Split screen on her TV. She didn't blink. Didn't change the channel. Just sat quietly. Then said to herself, "This is what happens when the door starts cracking open. They throw everything at it to keep it shut." That evening, Xavier met with his internal ethics board, something he insisted on establishing when Helix first launched. 12 people, diverse, fierce, unpaid. He laid the problem on the table. "Jared's critique isn't baseless," said Professor Delo, a fierce black queer philosopher. "Centralization can go sideways fast." "But transparency isn't optional anymore," added Priya, an urban education activist. "We just need guardrails." Xavier nodded. "So, what do we do?" Delo smirked. "You do what you always do, Temple." "Which is?" "You build the next thing before they can weaponize the current one." 2 weeks later, Helix announced a new initiative, Ethical Mirrors, a public, open-source, decentralized platform where any university, nonprofit, or donor could submit their own ethics standards and be transparently reviewed by peer coalitions, not just Helix. It wasn't just transparency. It was shared authorship. Jared Thomas posted a tweet. "I may not agree with everything, but this is how you lead. Respect." It had 112,000 likes. And suddenly, the storm quieted. Not because it was over, but because Xavier had absorbed the critique and turned it into a system. Again. At the Whitford estate, Victoria watched the rollout video in silence. "No matter what we throw," she muttered, "he doesn't swing back. He just builds something better." Preston, her husband, walked in quietly. "Maybe it's time to stop throwing." She didn't respond, because deep down, she knew she had run out of weapons. Back at Helix, Xavier sat alone, staring at a post-it note on his desk. It simply read, "It started with Mom." He smiled, then folded the note and placed it into his journal. A reminder that sometimes The most powerful revolutions come not from rage, but from dignity. It started with a rejection letter. No cameras, no viral moment. Just a plain PDF from Claremont University, one of the oldest academic institutions in the Northeast. After careful review, Claremont will not be participating in the Ethical Mirrors initiative at this time. One sentence. But the message was clear. We don't need your system. Xavier read the email twice, then a third time. He wasn't surprised. Claremont had been part of the same donor network that once blocked his early fellowship grant, a wound he never quite talked about, not even to Nia. Julian leaned over his shoulder. They're the first. Others may follow. Xavier didn't flinch. Then we keep building. But outside of Helix HQ, the impact spread fast. News outlets ran with it. Top university snubs Helix's transparency model. Is academia ready for accountability? Old guard pushes back, again. And inside the university world, tensions cracked open. A dean at Claremont anonymously told the Chronicle, there's growing fear, not of ethics, but of losing the power to define them. Lena Temple saw it all play out from her apartment in Newark. She'd just made tea, was halfway through folding laundry. Then a call came in, from someone she hadn't spoken to in over 15 years. Lena, a warm voice, hesitant. It's Carmen, from Jackson Street Elementary. Lena blinked. Carmen Wilson? Lord, it's been, what, since the choir days? Carmen laughed. Long enough to know you've been busy raising a movement. Lena smiled gently. I was just raising a boy. No, honey, Carmen said. You were preparing a storm. Later that evening, Carmen forwarded Lena a flyer, a small panel in Trenton. Topic: From Mother to Movement, Stories Behind Reform. It was quiet, local, not flashy, but Carmen had one line in her email. I think it's time they heard from the woman who raised the man. At first, Lena hesitated. She didn't do microphones, didn't like crowds, but then she remembered how they looked at her that day at the country club. Like she was invisible, like dignity had a dress code she didn't pass. And she replied, I'll be there. That Saturday, in a community center no bigger than a basketball court, Lena stepped to the mic. No designer heels, no filtered live stream, just her voice, and it cut through the silence. My son builds systems, she said calmly, because he saw too many people stuck behind the wrong ones. But long before that, I taught him how to walk into a room that didn't want him there and still look like he belonged. The audience leaned in. No one coughed, no one moved. So, no, I'm not surprised he's disrupting billion-dollar networks. I'm surprised it took this long. A clip from the panel hit YouTube, then TikTok, then Twitter. Soon, the caption read, She raised Xavier Temple, now she's raising the bar. And in under 24 hours, Lena Temple was trending. Meanwhile, the backlash to Claremont's refusal began building. A student coalition formed within days. Calling themselves Classroom for Accountability, they released a statement. If our university fears transparency, then maybe we should fear what it's hiding. Students began petitioning to bring ethical mirrors back. Professors signed open letters. And one alum, now a rising tech investor, froze a $4.5 million donation until Claremont reconsidered. Inside Whitford's estate, Victoria watched it unfold in silence. She turned to Lawson, her strategist. Tell me that wasn't his mother. Lawson nodded slowly. It was. Victoria's lips curled in something like a frown, but colder. She's not loud. No, Lawson said. She's worse. How so? He exhaled. She's credible. Back at Helix, Julian burst into Xavier's office. You see what your mom just did? Xavier raised an eyebrow. Please don't say viral. Viral, syndicated, captioned, subtitled in Korean. Pick your poison. Xavier smirked. She's gonna hate that. Julian grinned. Too late. Gen Z's calling her Mother Temple. Xavier watched the clip once, then again, but this time, not as a CEO, just as her son. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he whispered, "She just reminded them where I learned everything." 2 days later, Claremont reversed course. They released a carefully worded statement. "We believe in dialogue. We believe in learning." Helix's Ethical Mirrors initiative reflects values we share and hope to shape together. But no one was fooled. The pressure worked, the people spoke, and a gate that had been closed for generations cracked open. Lena was sitting by the window when Xavier called. "Mama?" "Yes, baby. You were incredible," she chuckled. "I didn't say anything you didn't already know." "No," he said quietly. "You said everything I needed the world to hear, better than I ever could." Lena paused. Then, softly, "You built a system. I just told them why." The studio lights were hot, the air in the room tense. It was supposed to be a feel-good segment, a national broadcast highlighting philanthropic partnerships in higher education. But what happened that morning on Morning Forum Live would change everything. The show's producers had invited Helix CEO Xavier Temple, alongside Harlan Brigg, board chair of the Abbott Foundation, one of the oldest, wealthiest, and most quietly powerful education funders in the country. They had donated over $2.7 billion to elite universities over the past 4 decades. No one had ever publicly questioned their ethics until today. 10 minutes into the segment, the anchor turned to Xavier with what was meant to be a softball question. "Xavier, Ethical Mirrors has been adopted by dozens of institutions. Are there any early surprises?" He hesitated, then smiled. Tight, restrained. 1. Last night, Helix's ethics transparency engine flagged the Abbott Foundation for multiple unresolved conflicts of interest, primarily relating to conditional funding tied to faculty appointments and curriculum content. The studio went dead silent. Harlan Brigg blinked. "Excuse me?" Xavier didn't flinch. 3 universities disclosed internal documentation. One even revealed that continued funding was contingent upon keeping specific professors off tenure tracks. Harlan's face turned a slow, deliberate red. The anchor stammered. Is this breaking news? We didn't want to go public until we had 3 confirmations. As of this morning, we do." Backstage, phones blew up. Producers panicked. Staff whispered. Twitter lit up. Abbott conflict trended within 14 minutes. By the time the segment ended, clips of Brigg's stunned face were being replayed on every news channel. At Helix HQ, Nia leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "You just dropped a nuke on live TV?" Julian laughed. "And they thought they invited you for PR." Xavier didn't smile, didn't even blink. "They thought ethics only worked one direction," he said. "But systems cut both ways." At the Abbott Foundation's headquarters, panic turned into fury. Board members shouted. Legal counsel was on speed dial. Harlan stood at the window, seething. "How the hell did he get those documents?" Their CFO, Judith Renner, replied quietly, "Because the schools finally trust someone more than they fear us." By noon, 3 universities issued joint statements confirming the Helix findings. They had, for decades, accepted conditional funding tied to policy compliance. The revelation sparked outrage. Students protested, professors resigned, donors froze support. The impact moved fast, too fast. By 5 p.m., the Abbott Foundation's ethics score on Helix's public dashboard dropped from A to D. And by evening, $1.1 billion university-aligned funding was suspended pending review. Inside the Whitford estate, Victoria watched the coverage with narrowed eyes. "They're not playing games anymore." Lawson nodded. "You're watching a shift in power, not symbolic, functional. And where does that leave us? On the wrong side of transparency." But Victoria had one card left to play. She made a call. "Get me a meeting with the Renaissance Consortium." Lawson hesitated. "That's dangerous territory." "I don't care." The Renaissance Consortium was old money. older than Abbott, a collective of 6 billionaire families that controlled massive legacy funds, real estate networks, and endowments from Boston to San Diego. They rarely appeared publicly, but when they moved, they did it quietly and effectively. 3 days later, Xavier received a formal invitation to a private gathering. No cameras, no phones, no press. It simply read, "Dinner, Wednesday, 7 p.m., Longview Estate. Consider it a conversation." Julian read the card out loud. "You think it's a trap?" Naya nodded instantly. "It's not a dinner, it's a warning." But Xavier, he wasn't rattled. "Good," he said. "Let's see who's really behind the curtain." The estate was massive, quiet, secluded, a private chef, oak walls, crystal glass, and seated around the table, 3 men, 2 women, 1 empty chair. As Xavier entered, a gray-haired man, Dawson Harrow, the eldest of the consortium, stood. "Mr. Temple, we admire your efficiency, but some things move slower for a reason." Xavier sat, calm as stone. "I'm not against tradition, just against silence." A blonde woman leaned forward, Elaine Roth, who chaired 3 education boards. "Your system is bleeding institutions. Students are rioting, professors are quitting, endowments are destabilizing." "And you see that as a feature?" added Harrow. "Not a bug." Xavier didn't blink. "I see that as a detox. You want to burn it all down?" "No," he said coldly. "I want to stop pretending the rot isn't there." There was a pause. Then Harrow spoke again. "You're forcing us to decide, Mr. Temple. If this continues, Helix will lose every major funding partner in the next fiscal year. The machine won't just freeze you out, it will erase you." Xavier leaned back, then said one line that stunned the room. "I didn't build Helix to survive. I built it to make sure the next version doesn't need me at all. No threats, no yelling, just truth. Unshakable." The dinner ended in silence. As Xavier walked to the car, Julian was waiting. "What happened?" Xavier looked at the night sky. They blinked. 2 days later, 5 mid-sized universities formally cut ties with the Renaissance-aligned funding streams. Instead, they joined Helix's ethical coalition, pledging to publish all external funding terms, board affiliations, and influence records annually. The media exploded. The New York Times ran the headline, "The accountability reckoning has a name, Temple." And back in Newark, Lena read the headline while folding clothes. She smiled quietly, then whispered, "Let them erase you, baby. Just make sure you leave the blueprint behind." It began with a whisper, a single tweet, then a screenshot, then a 34-second clip from 10 years ago. Xavier Temple in college, standing near a dorm hallway confrontation. Out of context, low res, but framed perfectly for one thing: a scandal. By noon, 4 right-wing outlets had picked it up. By 3 p.m., it was the top headline on National Liberty Channel. "He builds ethics systems, but look who he once protected." A professor had been accused of misconduct years ago. Xavier had been seen with him. There was no proof of wrongdoing, no connection. But the clip spun a narrative that Xavier had shielded a predator. Inside Helix HQ, chaos broke out. The legal team scrambled. Julian cursed into his phone. Naya was already combing through archives for a statement. But the damage was happening in real time. Influencers latched on. Trolls ran with it. Suddenly, Ethical Mirrors wasn't about accountability. It was about hypocrisy. And across town, in a glossy office with high windows, Victoria Whitford watched quietly. She didn't need to say a word. Her assistant whispered, "It's sticking." Victoria just sipped her tea, then said, "Truth doesn't matter. Timing does." That night, Xavier sat in the dark. No screens, no calls, just the hum of city noise outside. Naya found him like that. She sat beside him. Quiet for a moment. Then finally, "You okay?" He didn't answer at first. Then softly, "This isn't about the past. It's about what they fear will build next." Naya placed a hand on his. "So what now?" He looked at her. "Now I let the one person they'll never be able to twist speak." The next morning, Lena Temple walked into a packed church hall in Newark. No camera crews this time, but hundreds of people had come. Neighbors, friends, students, former teachers. Some didn't even know her, just knew her story. She took the mic, didn't read from a script, didn't clear her throat, just breathed in and began. "I raised my son in a time where boys like him had to be twice as good just to be seen as equal. Not better, just equal. And I didn't raise a perfect man. I raised a principled one. So, if you're asking whether he's ever stood beside someone later found guilty, probably. But if you're asking whether he's ever hidden the truth to protect power, never." A video of her speech went viral by midnight. But this time, the tide turned. Thousands reposted her words with the caption, "We trust the mother who raised him." And in a stunning moment of solidarity, 4 university presidents held a joint press conference. "We are not pulling out of ethical mirrors, we are doubling down." Back in the Whitford estate, Lawson looked pale. "This isn't working. It's backfiring." Victoria didn't blink. "Then leak the deposition." Lawson hesitated. "That's off limits." We agreed. "I'm done agreeing." The next morning, a sealed deposition from a whistleblower inside Helix was leaked. It claimed Xavier had pressured faculty behind the scenes, manipulated ethics scores. It was false, manufactured, signed by a former intern who'd been dismissed for data theft. But the media didn't care. It was now a war of perception. Inside Helix HQ, the team knew they couldn't just play defense. Julian banged his fist on the table. "They want blood. They want doubt." Xavier stood, calm. "Then let's give them what they hate more than anything." Naya raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" He smiled faintly. "Receipts." That night, Helix went live. Not a press conference, a full public transparency upload. Every financial transaction, every internal vote, every algorithm update, every ethics score appeal, every audit since year 1. No one had ever done this. It was radical, it was raw, and it was proof. Within hours, journalists confirmed the leaks were lies. 3 media outlets issued retractions. The intern was subpoenaed, and the Whitford family's fingerprints showed up in more places than they wanted. By week's end, Ethical Mirrors had gained 17 new partners, including 2 Ivy League schools. The momentum was back, but more than that, so was the public's trust. In a quiet moment, Lena and Xavier sat together on her front porch. No reporters, no headlines, just peace. She looked at him and asked, "You tired yet?" He chuckled. "Exhausted," she smiled. "Good, that means you're doing it right." Then she leaned in and whispered, "You know, I once prayed that God would make you invisible, so you wouldn't get hurt." Xavier turned. "But now?" She looked straight ahead. "Now I pray they see you, clearly. All of you, even the parts they're afraid of." Helix HQ, 7:13 a.m. Julian burst into Xavier's office with 2 things in his hands, a cup of black coffee and a folder he shouldn't have been able to print. "Check this out," he said, slamming the folder down. Xavier raised an eyebrow. Julian opened it. Inside were internal purchase notices, affiliate transfer records, and 3 layers of shell company ownership. The final sheet read, "Proposed acquisition. Helix Systems, 38.7% equity buy-in via Genesis Harbor Capital." Naya joined seconds later. She looked furious. "They're trying to buy us from the inside." Xavier flipped through the paperwork slowly. Quiet. Then, "Who's behind Genesis Harbor?" Julian looked up, eyes hard. "Whitford. Through a dummy LLC in Nassau, nested inside a university endowment fund. It was brilliant and dangerous. If they succeeded in crossing 40%, they could trigger Helix's soft veto clause, an internal governance rule that allowed them to vote down major system changes, delay platform rollouts, or worse, override ethics recalibrations. In short, weaponize Helix against itself. By 10 a.m., Xavier called an emergency meeting with the Ethics Council, the internal oversight board made up of professors, activists, policy engineers, and public transparency advocates. He laid out everything. When he finished, one council member asked quietly, "Can we stop it?" Another leaned in. "Can we afford to?" Xavier didn't hesitate. "We can't afford not to." That night, Xavier reviewed their emergency options with Nia and Julian. Option 1. Activate the Equity Firewall Clause, a rarely used protocol allowing Helix's board to suspend external investor voting rights for 90 days in case of hostile threat. Option 2. Burn the house down, liquidate all open investment tracks, restructure Helix into a non-profit trust, and give permanent veto rights to the Ethics Council instead of investors. The second would mean walking away from $260 in future funding. Julian looked sick. "That's not just nuclear. That's extinction level." Xavier leaned forward. His voice was low, steady. "They think we care about the money. They forgot we care about the mission." The next morning, Helix issued a board freeze protocol, citing unusual acquisition activity. Immediately, media outlets scrambled for explanation. The Whitford legal team responded within hours, calling the move panicked, unprofessional, and deeply anti-capitalist. Victoria Whitford even released a carefully worded press statement. "Ethical systems must be scalable, but what's ethical for some may not be sustainable for others. We support innovation, but not insularity." Translation: they planned to force a restructure, whether Helix liked it or not. Meanwhile, Lena received a quiet visitor, a tall, older man in a gray wool coat. His name, Thomas Bardem, former civil rights attorney, now head of a policy think tank that advised Congress on ethics tech legislation. He sat at her kitchen table, sipped her tea, and said, "Your son's about to be hit by something deeper than business. It's institutional backlash, masked as reform." Lena nodded slowly. "And you came to warn me?" He shook his head. "I came to ask if he'll burn it all, or rewrite the playbook." Inside Helix's glass meeting room, Xavier stood before his team. Behind him was a single slide. Helix 2.0, structural integrity, investor control. He outlined a new model. Convert all governance to a public benefit framework. Stakeholder-led ethics revisions. Transparent code base. Permanent ban on ownership over 20% by any one entity. All board members must pass ethics review every 6 months. Some board members looked pale. One investor stormed out. But the room stayed mostly quiet until a younger engineer from Atlanta raised her hand. "So, we become a fortress?" Xavier shook his head. "No, we become a lighthouse." By end of day, Helix filed reclassification paperwork with the SEC. They moved 14.2M into an untouchable trust. All acquisition paths were frozen. The market shuddered. Some called it suicide. But others, dozens of small universities, non-profit groups, student unions, and even European regulators, cheered. #Helix Rebuild began trending. Back in the Whitford estate, Victoria stared at the headlines. Her hands trembled, just a little. "They gave up the money?" she whispered. Lawson replied flatly, "No, they gave up your game." And on a rainy night in Newark, Xavier sat alone at a train station bench, hood up, hands in pockets, watching the city blur through the storm. Lena walked up beside him. "You did it," she said. He didn't look at her, just replied softly, "No, I just made sure it can't be undone." She placed her hand over his. That's the difference between winning and building. The ballroom at the Ethics Forum Summit in D.C. was full to capacity. Over 1,200 seats. Every chair taken, dozens of cameras, live stream feeds in 6 languages. Behind the stage, Xavier stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his collar. Not his tie. He had chosen not to wear one. Not tonight. "Ready?" Nia asked from behind him. He exhaled. "As I'll ever be." Earlier that day, something unexpected happened. 3 major Ivy League universities publicly severed all private ethics tech contracts tied to the Whitford Foundation. They cited ethical incompatibility. At the same time, 2 EU regulatory bodies issued a joint moratorium on any algorithmic systems without third-party oversight, a direct echo of Helix's new model. Victoria Whitford? Nowhere to be seen. Her legal team released a vague statement citing ongoing estate restructuring, but those inside knew what it meant. Whitford Capital had lost control of the future. When Xavier walked onto that stage, the applause wasn't explosive. It wasn't even loud. It was something different, sustained, intentional, real. He stood behind the podium, looked at the sea of faces, paused for a long second. Then, 4 months ago, my mother was publicly humiliated in front of a room that believed money could define dignity. That belief has built entire systems, schools, courts, banks, planes, boardrooms. Systems that tell people like her, you don't belong unless we say you do. The room went silent. Helix was never just about scoring behavior. It was about restoring balance to the space between power and personhood. Today, we're making that vision permanent. He unveiled the Civic Ethics Charter, mandatory ethical review for all platforms tied to public institutions, real-time accountability dashboards accessible by the public, a new equity algorithm weighted by dignity impact, not just data bias, an international audit board composed of teachers, nurses, veterans, and students, not investors. We're not replacing power with a new version of it. We're distributing it across every desk, kitchen, and sidewalk this system has ever ignored. He closed his speech with one sentence. Ethics is not a technology, it's a choice. The audience stood, not clapping wildly, but rising, like something sacred had just been witnessed. In the front row, Lena Temple wiped a quiet tear. The next day, over 47 organizations signed on to adopt the charter. A week later, the FAA and Department of Education announced pilot programs using Helix protocols for transparency and review. By month's end, the first public ethics dashboard went live at Newark Liberty Airport, the same airport where Lena Temple had once been humiliated. It displayed in real time crew behavior index, passenger dignity score, transparency history. Last 10. Recorded incidents. Resolution outcomes. People stopped, looked, took pictures. They started to believe this might actually change something. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in a marble hall in Geneva, the International Civil Rights Commission issued a rare commendation to Helix Systems for redefining the intersection of equity, accountability, and technology. They invited Xavier Temple and Lena Temple to deliver a joint address at the Global Ethics Assembly, and still, no word from Victoria Whitford. Rumors swirled that she'd quietly sold off assets, that she was fighting lawsuits, that she was moving to Switzerland. But no one really cared anymore. The world was turning its attention elsewhere, to the people building what came next. Back in Newark, Xavier and Lena stood together on the Helix building rooftop. The city buzzed below them. A billboard nearby flashed the new campaign. You have the right to dignity, not someday, not if approved, but now. Lena sipped her tea. You know, I used to pray God would shield you from all this. The spotlight, the noise. Xavier smiled gently. You think it worked? She laughed. No, but I think God gave you something better, a reason to stay in it. He nodded slowly, then looked up at the sky. It was clear. No noise, No storm, just air, just space, and a future wide open. Not quiet, but finally, just. If you've ever wished someone would finally stand up and say, "That's enough," maybe this story felt personal. What would you have done if it were your mom? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you believe power should come with accountability.